Welcome to Independent Sources. I'm Garry Pierre-Pierre.
And I'm Vianora Vinca. Ethnic media runs the gamut from small niche newspapers to major media outlets, and so does ownership. Some publications remain in the hands of ethnic entrepreneurs. Other media have been bought by large news organizations.
For instance, BET is owned by Viacom, one of the largest media conglomerates in the world. Telemundo is part of NBC Universal. There are Chinese and Russian publications in New York that belong to large companies based overseas.
Even media mogul Rupert Murdoch has moved into the ethnic media arena.
On this edition of Independent Sources, we looked at who owns ethnic media and what impact ownership has on news coverage and on the community.
We explore how ethnic media covers sensitive religious issues when faced with keeping the faith.
And we profile a magazine for African Americans that highlights opportunities in Africa.
Those stories and news of the week after this.
I think we're the foot soldiers of journalism. I think we're the guys out there interacting with the community at the coalface, talking about the local stories that will never make the New York Times or the Daily News, and the kind of stories that matter in people's individual lives.
Ethnic media remains a vibrant and viable news sector even in these tough economic times, and that makes it an attractive investment even for those outside the immediate community. What impact, if any, does ownership have on the product and the audience? To discuss this issue, we're joined by Veena Merchant, former publisher of News India Times, and David Greaves, publisher of Our Time Press.
David, we've talked so much about the ethnic media, the community media.
Sure.
Who owns that media sector?
Well, you know, it's so varied. Our publication is owned by my wife and myself, you know, independent publication, but there are some publications that are owned by very large corporations. So a lot of times people think of ethnic media, they think of very small press, but that's not necessarily the case. A lot of times there are large publications in other countries that would be like the New York Times having a bureau someplace else, or publishing a paper overseas. So it can be small, large. It's very varied.
But can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Is it run like a franchise, or do they actually own it? Do you know what I'm saying?
Well, I mean, what was your ownership like? You know,
mine was very private,
Okay.
but I'm talking about the large corporations that he spoke of, Garry, that I was wondering what kind of ownership is that? Is that a franchise type? Because in South Asian media, there's only one newspaper, which is a larger corporation in New Delhi. But the point is that they are more run like a franchise rather than a ownership.
No, I don't think they own. They're mostly a weekly version of that huge daily in a mother country.
But the ownership remains the same corporation?
Yes, it's the same corporation.
News Corporation has been buying newspaper chains in Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and one paper that he bought, part of the Courier Life chain of publication, is Caribbean Life. We have this clip from its publisher. Let's watch.
Well, I know there's a lot of concern in the general readership and in the whole national press that big media, the fact that big media is buying up a lot of the community newspapers, that it takes away the voice from the people, and that the people who should tell the stories are not telling it. And this has not affected us in that particular way. As a matter of fact, I think the purchase has affected us positively in that we're definitely able to produce a better looking paper.
Veena, do you believe that ownership in this case will not affect content?
I think it depends on the kind of contract or kind of deal that you make and the kind of person that buys it. Because if you change it too much, let's say if I were to be in the place of a corporation buying a smaller media, if I change it too much, then it won't be productive for me in money terms. You know what I'm saying? I'd lose my readership, I'd lose a lot. which is why it doesn't change.
What News Corporation has been doing is, as I said, buying so many papers,
Sure.
and some of them right now are covering the same areas in Brooklyn. One paper that they just bought is the Brooklyn paper, and it was very critical of the Atlantic Yards Development Project, which the New York Post, belonging to the same company, News Corporation, have supported it. So this is just one example of how content differs. How realistic is it, David, to expect that the Brooklyn paper will continue to have the same sort of journalism?
Sure. I think that really depends on the integrity of the local publisher. You know, for us in where we are, I have not seen any change in the paper. I've not been examining it closely. But for us, we like our ownership being so small. We're able to stay very close to the stories on the ground, so to speak. One of the things that the News Corporation is able to do is able to combine advertisers, and they're able to therefore charge a lower rate locally, but by having these large corporate advertisers.
Does that affect your business somewhat? Does that take away from advertisers who would?
We've had to adjust our rates somewhat. Yeah, absolutely. We have had to, and they've tried to put a smaller paper into our area, and that didn't work out. So it's hand-to-hand combat down there where we are.
Well, speaking of hand-to-hand combat, I mean, we all know the situation with the newspaper business in general, and with ethnic or community newspapers, which form of ownership do you think is more likely to fare better in these hard economic times? Tina?
I'm not sure, but in the hard economic times, you need a bit of deep pockets, and I think the larger corporation probably would do better.
Sure.
You agree?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It's because for us, if a large advertiser pulls out, as a couple of them have because of the economic conditions, that's a very big hit for us. But if you've got deep pockets, Rupert Murdoch's pockets, I would imagine that's not quite as difficult to get through that. You know?
But the only thing is that corporations cannot be not sensitive to the community news.
Sure.
If they stop being, then that's finished. Or if there is a matter of, can I deviate from the subject a little bit? May I?
Let's not go too far, though.
Okay. No, what I'm saying is, when I'm talking about sensitivity to community news, is the fact that today we all are trying to fight against the web. Let's face it. Whether it's community or it's the larger newspapers. In fighting the web style doesn't work as far as I'm concerned. I think you've got to keep the same integrity of news. And as long as they keep it, then there is no problem.
Well, I keep trying to make money on the web with the paper, finding it very hard to do. I don't know,
But is the web making money? That's the issue. It's not yet.
It isn't making money overall? Not for me, certainly, no.
Not from what I hear.
No.
I mean, certainly I can't say but our website wasn't. But the point is that, is the web really making money? No.
No.
Let me ask you, are there any positives, in your opinion, on the big corporations buying these smaller community papers?
Positive? Well, positives for them. I don't believe it's positive for the local community. I just don't. They simply can't have the same relationship. I don't think.
Why not? If they, as we just said before,
Sure.
that it's in their interest to keep the same content and be sensible to the community, why is it not good for community?
Well, you say you would like them to be sensitive to community, but a lot of times they're most sensitive to, if you will, the bottom line, and whether or not they actually contribute to the local community is really a secondary situation. With us, it's a primary situation. We have non-profits who really depend on us to, get the people out to their seminars, to their events, and we're able to do that because we do publish very, very locally.
And Vina, you recently sold News India Times, and the other was Desi Talk. How do you think that the coverage will play out with the new ownership for your community?
Well, it's a community person who has bought it, so I don't see that there can be any change at all. If there is, it may be a personality issue, but I doubt very much. Because my publisher was such a successful publisher, he was the first mover in the market, that anybody who buys his product will have to keep to the same, really.
Was it important, Vina, for the ownership of your publications be Indian?
Well, not for me, but my publisher always wanted to sell it to an Indian, because he was very strong belief that unless you're Indian, you don't understand Indian issues. But I'm not sure of that, because as long as the editor is Indian, I think it doesn't matter who puts the dollar in. That's my view.
So funny, for me, an African American paper, I think it's very important that it's owned by an African American.
Sure.
Yeah, otherwise, you're not going to get the same sensitivity to the issues. Absolutely.
Can the remaining independent community papers compete successfully with a paper that was just bought by a news corporation and will have a new look, as we're expecting them to have? Can they compete successfully? I think
so. I think we have to, as I have, cut your expenses, be more aggressive in terms of the advertising, looking for advertising, not necessarily large advertisers, but a lot of local advertisers. If the large corporations make decisions that for reasons that don't really have to do with the local community, but you can get small advertisers, smaller stores, small non-profits who really have to stay on the ground. And as long as you stay on the ground and stay with them on the ground, I think we will survive. Absolutely.
That's all the time we have today. Vina Merchant, David Greaves, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Now here's Abi Ishola with some other news.
Thanks, Vianora. Here's a look at some headlines from the ethnic media. From the Jewish Forward, Uri Lasetic, an Orthodox social justice group, announced that it would be giving 7 different kosher restaurants an ethical seal for obeying labor laws. This comes a year after a raid at the agri-processors' kosher slaughterhouse in Iowa revealed very poor working conditions at the plant. The raid ignited a firestorm of debate in the Jewish community. Critics argue that these businesses shouldn't be named ethical for simply obeying the law. India is moving full steam ahead with securing its nuclear deal with the United States. India Abroad reports that Meera Shankar, India's new ambassador to the U.S., says India is ready to create agreements to build nuclear reactors with assistance from the United States. Koreans in New York are hoping to secure a seat on the city council this fall. The Korea Times reports that 4 Korean Americans have registered as candidates. Representatives from various Korean organizations are calling for an increase in voter turnout among Korean communities. And finally, from India West, 2 medical researchers are trying to create an infection-fighting serum to combat swine flu. Rafi Ahmed of Emory University and Patrick Wilson of the University of Chicago say the antibody would offer temporary immunity to the virus and would be available quicker than a vaccine. Those are just a few headlines from the ethnic media. Back to you, Vianora.
Stories about sexual abuse by Catholic priests have filled the pages of mainstream newspapers for years. Recently, similar stories about Jewish rabbis hit the press. So how has ethnic media handled these sensitive subjects, especially when serving communities that may have deep religious convictions? Ari Goldman is a former New York Times writer. Neil O'Dowd is publisher of The Irish Voice. They teach a course at Columbia's journalism school about reporting on religion. Garry recently sat down with them to talk about covering controversy and keeping the faith.
Ari, why is coverage of religion so important?
Well, religion is a great motivator for people. It shapes their lives, their day. Not everyone, of course. There are many people who don't practice faith, but most people can connect to it. It's the faith they were brought up with. It's faith is a place they turn to when they're in crisis, when they have a personal family issue, life cycle events, so that religion is a place that that a lot of people gather around and feel strongly about.
Okay. Neil, for Irish Americans, what is religion? How do they react to religion?
Well, you know, obviously, if you came from Ireland as I did, religion was a huge issue, whether it was from the Irish Republic, which was overwhelmingly Roman Catholic, or Northern Ireland, indeed, where there was a conflict for 300 years on the basis of what religion did you have. I think Irish Americans bring a lot of that with them, too. I mean, obviously, majority of them are Irish Catholic, but I think it's something that has changed so dramatically in the last 15 years that they wouldn't recognise the religion that maybe they started off with. Certainly issues like church scandals, you know, the downfall in the number of priests, how the church has changed so dramatically, how once upon a time the church pontificated and everyone else just responded. Now it's a much more questioning church, I think, for Irish Americans.
Does the Irish Voice raise these issues, look at the church in a critical eye? Recently, New York had a new Cardinal Dolan, right, and there have been a lot of scandals. When you covered his coming to New York, were some of these backgrounds included in the articles, and how did your readers react to that?
Oh, very definitely. I mean, you know, we look at a guy like Dolan, he says all the right things, he does the right things, but underneath it all is a Pope John Paul II fundamentalist, and that's how we covered him, that's how we portrayed him, and he's got a lot to prove in the Irish American community. I think the interesting thing about Dolan is just what a great pastoral priest he seems to be, and I think that's what New York Catholics and New York Irish need right now, is someone who can rebuild some confidence in the institution. So it'll be very interesting to cover him and to see how he develops over the next year or two.
Aren't some people, though, happy about his being towing the line of the Vatican? I mean, they're not all. Some people like that combination of a guy who's friendly and pastoral, but yet, you know, keeps the old-time religion, even if they don't practice the old-time religion.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's been, you know, the Cardinal O'Connor experience is what people here look back to, who was vastly more popular than his successor. And I think people are looking at Dolan in the same light. But I think that from my newspaper's point of view, we'd have a liberal Catholic view of him, that he has a lot to prove in terms of how he deals with the community, how he deals with issues. His early stuff has been quite hardline when you look underneath the surface, the same sex and all that stuff. While you would expect him to say that, there was no great compassion in his words, and I think that's something.
Speaking of same sex, that's been a big topic, Ari, with Governor Patterson declaring that he's going to fight for that. How is that being played in the ethnic or mainstream media?
Yeah. There's this like bifurcation. I was fascinated when Cardinal Dolan was installed. He's now an archbishop. He will eventually be a cardinal. But there in the front row at St. Patrick's, you had Governor Patterson, you had Mayor Bloomberg, you had all these people who were there to honor him. And yet the next day they were all going to go vote for same-sex marriage, which he's against. You know, and so there's this. You know, people have this sort of split in their worldview, where they want to honor the cardinal. That's part of their political responsibility, but they want to pursue their agenda.
And how has the Irish voice come down on this issue?
Well, we have a long history of clashing with church. We came out in favour of gays marching in St. Patrick's Day Parade, which may not seem like a huge thing for people, but in the Irish American community, it's a very, very big day. And we got wrapped in the knuckles at one point by Cardinal O'Connor for that. The paper itself did. We see it as a sort of an issue that it's a civil rights issue. I mean, there are so many Irish that we know who are in relationships, and we see up close what happens when they can't visit someone who's ill in hospital or something like that, when they don't have the same rights as a married couple. So it's a human rights issue, and I'm delighted to see the way the debate is going. It seems to be going in favour of same-sex marriage.
And the reaction from the church evidently was not very positive to your coverage. What about the community, your readers? How did they come down on this?
People are a lot more prepared to listen to the argument. It's not nearly as hostile as you get the sense from the Bill Donohues and people like that, screaming and shouting from the rooftops anytime anything liberal is put forward. I think there's quite an interested community that is well capable of taking on more than one opinion at a time and weighing them up and sort of deciding the issue. I think the American Catholic experience, the best parts of it, are in many ways, you know, very close to what, say, President Obama is talking about now. Issues of human rights, issues talking about poor people in society. I think this obsession that the Catholic Church has had with issues like abortion and same-sex has done them incredible damage, and I think there's no debate in the church on those issues, and I think that's becoming very evident.
And lately we've heard a lot of stories about rabbis abusing young boys and girls. Ari, talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Is this a new phenomenon or what?
Well, this is something that had been under the surface and talked about in the Jewish community. There were very few times when it actually got much press. There was a case almost 10 years ago now that the New York Jewish Week wrote about that became a huge issue. It was a Rabbi Lanner who eventually went to prison for 7 years for abusing boys and girls who he was working with in an Orthodox Jewish youth program. More recently, Assemblyman Dov Heikind was campaigning, not politically, but campaigning to expose this issue, went on radio, has a radio show, and he said, if you've been abused, if you know someone's been abused, call me. I want to hear about it because we've got to clean up this issue. 1,000 people called. Wow. And they talked to him, left records, messages.
You certainly couldn't follow up with these calls.
And then there was no way to follow up. And then when the district attorney came and said, okay, give me your files, he said, no, they're confidential. So he got himself out there, but then he got into a lot of trouble because now he's suppressing evidence.
Is this a sensitive issue in the Orthodox Jewish community?
Huge, hugely. I mean, what's different about the Jewish community than the Catholic community is that there's no centralized hierarchy, and there's so many different heads of organizations and denominations and branches that it's hard to say anything make any blanket statement about the Jewish community. But this is a horror. I mean, especially for the Orthodox, who are very sort of protective of their institutions and somewhat secretive, and it's very male-dominated, in a lot of the organizations. There's a lot of room for abuse there, and the community's doing what it can to clean it up.
The Jewish Forward has been out front on this issue, really writing a lot of stories.
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to what Neil was saying earlier about the ability of the ethnic media to cover its own community the way that no one else will. And the Forward has been very good about it. And then there have been some wonderful web reporting on this. Some people are just obsessed with the topic and have made, broken a lot of stories. But there are greater protections for children, better reporting procedures, so that things are getting better, but it's still a festering problem.
And the same scandal happened, perhaps still happening in the Catholic community. How did you cover that? Or are you still following the issue?
Not as much as we used to, but one of the great things about teaching with Ari is understanding just the depth of this issue, not just across Catholic and Jewish, but across almost every faith community that there are these kind of scandals. I think the Catholic one, though, is a fundamental one about the issue of, should the hierarchy be married, for instance, what kind of people are getting into the priesthood. I don't think those issues have been fully addressed yet. And I think those are issues that are very much front and center. And in my newspaper, anytime we print anything that, would seem to be, saying, okay, why can't priests get married or whatever, you'd be amazed at the amount of support for people who will say, it's time we moved into the 21st century. And I think there is a good liberal movement out there now in the Catholic Church because of all the scandal, because of everything else, that has given them a voice.
I'll say there's one great thing about teaching in a journalism school is that you have all these reporters who are, and we send our students out, they're reporters, they got to learn how to be reporters. And one of the things we did is everyone in the class reported on sex scandals within a particular religious denomination. So we have 16 students, and we looked at Buddhism and Hinduism and the Sikhs and the Protestants and the Jews, and everybody had a story.
Really?
I mean, no one has escaped this scandal. I mean, this goes on.
Why is this so prevalent?
I think, in fairness, it's much more prevalent in closed communities like, say, Orthodox Jewish or Catholic, where you have a kind of almost a hierarchy, whereas in some of the other communities it's more difficult. But I think the fundamental issue for Catholicism really will come down to the issue of celibacy and whether or not the people who are coming into the priesthood are really suited to be. But I think the sad thing is, I spoke about this to the class, just my own wife, for instance, now has to go through, because she does lunchroom with my kid at school, my 9-year-old daughter, now has to go through a whole sexual training thing. And it just seems the whole thing has become, the church is so worried about being indemnified against scandal that there's almost a reaction the other way. And unfortunately, as she said, any male teacher in my kid's school is now under grave suspicion for nothing really other than being a male and teaching kids.
We'll have to leave it at that. Neil O'Dowd, thank you very much. Ari Goldman, thank you.
Thank you.
You promised me the world. Is this what you had in mind?
Every choice we make has a consequence. Help EarthShare and its members restore balance to the world. Visit earthshare.org and see what you can do. EarthShare, one environment, one simple way to care for it.
We end our show with a profile of the Network Journal. The magazine targets African-American professionals and business owners. It has an eye toward Africa and establishing connections. Judith Escalona has the report.
What corporate America really thinks of Africa. You see, they've never done anything like this. I've been following the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for the longest while, since the 1980s when I started as a professional journalist. And I've never seen them do anything like this. This is exactly what we were saying. Africa is hot, and not hot as a place for aid and charity, but for business and investment.
Rosalind McLymont has been bullish about Africa since she traveled to the Congo as a young financial reporter in the 1970s. As editor-in-chief of the Network Journal, she continues to push for African Americans to become more involved in Africa through investment, entrepreneurial ventures, and employment. Since its founding 15 years ago, the Network Journal has been reporting on African American-owned enterprises and professionals who are at the top of their game. The monthly glossy features personal profiles, economic trends, political analyses, and opportunities for the Black professional and business owner.
We have no competitor. This is a niche that we have moved into. Our circulation is we're moving towards 30,000 paid circulation. Our readership is over 80,000.
Their website, tnj.com, expands their reach and offers additional articles and videos not found in the magazine. The Network Journal has also entered the publishing arena, recently releasing Africa Strictly Business, a compilation of articles written by McLymont while she worked as a correspondent based in Africa.
The more I went back into those Africa-focused columns and those trading with Africa columns, that reports that I did for Shipping Digest, the more I saw a chronicling of Africa's own initiatives in terms of developing itself. And you don't hear about this. You hear about these, drugs that are being created by the major pharmaceutical companies, and they're not being delivered, and all sorts of things. It's always the external Tarzan who comes in with some sort of, if it's not aid, then a cure or technology. You never hear about what's being developed there, and it is happening. So this is what Africa Strictly Business is about. This is what Dambisa Moyo's book is about.
McLymont is referring to Dambisa Moyo's controversial book, Dead Aid, that calls for an end to aid to Africa. According to Moyo, aid has damaged the political and economic development of the continent. Africa, for McLymont, is an economic powerhouse in the making, once freed of the shackles of aid and the negative images of the dark continent. For Independent Sources, I'm Judith Escalona.
That's our show. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.
In the meantime, be independent-minded.